I'll tell you how it ended first, because the middle part is hard to get through without knowing there's an ending. I walked out. That's the ending. I walked out of the nursery bay on level 4 with a bullet in my left shoulder, 2 cracked ribs, a hairline fracture in my right ankle, a gash along my jaw that needed 11 stitches, and the particular kind of silence that follows a thing you cannot take back. I walked out and the specimen designated Joey 7 did not. That's the ending. Everything before it is the part I have to explain. My name is Karen Moore. I was a field-certified instructor at the Meyerling Institute of Xenobiological Studies, the one on the tertiary ring, not the research branch on Proxima Station, though by the end it wouldn't have mattered which branch you named. I had been there for 6 years. I had a small apartment in the staff residential block, a standing arrangement with the commissary for black coffee at 0600, and a reputation for being thorough in ways that occasionally annoyed the administrative staff. I didn't cut corners on my assessment reports. I documented what I observed rather than what I was supposed to observe. In 6 years, that had created roughly 14 separate friction points with Director Meyerling's office. The 15th friction point was Joey 7. I want to be precise about the timeline, because precision is what separates a credible incident report from the kind of document that gets filed under anomalous and never opened again. I arrived on level 4 on a Tuesday morning in the late part of a long season. The assignment came through standard channels: a post-gestation behavioral assessment, routine observation of a contained specimen, 2 weeks on site with daily logs submitted to Dr. Artis in the developmental wing. Posting noted the specimen was 6 months post-emergence, stable, non-ambulatory, no registered threat classification. I should have asked who wrote that threat assessment. I didn't. That's on me. Level 4 was not where the Academy kept its impressive things. Levels 1 through 3 were the showcase, the stellar cartography suites, the xenolinguistics theater, the training simulators, where the cadets ran their contact scenario drills. Level 4 was below all of that, below the atrium, below the observation galleries, below the cafeteria, and its persistent smell of rehydrated protein. Level 4 smelled like antiseptic, and something underneath antiseptic that the antiseptic was working very hard to cover. The corridors were narrower there. The lighting was cooler. The staff who worked the permanent rotation on 4 had a particular quality to them. Not unfriendly exactly, but careful in a way that read less like professional discretion and more like people who had learned not to say certain things out loud. Artis met me at the access gate. He was a small man with the precise movements of someone who had spent decades in laboratory environments and had absorbed the lab's rhythm into his bones. He shook my hand. He told me the posting would be straightforward. He told me Joey 7 had been exhibiting remarkable developmental markers for its age and classification, cognitive benchmarks well outside the predicted range, neural activity that was, in his word, exceptional. He said it the way you say something you've been told to say rather than something you believe. I took the room they'd prepared for me in the level 4 residential annex. Barely more than a bunk and a desk and a window that looked out onto the inner corridor rather than any sky. And I read the existing assessment file before I slept. The file was 43 pages. Of those 43 pages, 31 were administrative forms, access logs, and procedural documentation. The actual observational data was 12 pages. Of those 12 pages, 8 concerned the specimen's physical development, growth rate, and nutritional intake. 4 pages addressed behavior. Those 4 pages had been written by 3 different observers in sequence. The first observer's entries ran for 11 days before they stopped. The second observer's entries ran for 6 days. The third observer had managed 4 entries before the last one, which ended mid-sentence, and was not followed by a formal sign-off or a transfer notation. Just the half-finished sentence, and then blank lines, and then my name typed at the top of the next section as the incoming assessor. I noted all of this. I wrote it into my personal log. I did not yet say what I thought it meant, because I wanted to observe first and conclude second. That was the methodology I'd been trained on, and it had served me reasonably well for 6 years. The first time I saw Joey 7, it was through the observation port, a reinforced pane set into the nursery bay door, roughly 40 centimeters wide and 30 tall. The bay itself was warm and dimly lit, the walls curved to reduce hard angles, the floor padded. Standard comfort specifications for a specimen of this developmental stage and physical form. The specimen lay in the center of the bay, on its back, in a posture that matched nothing in the behavioral file. The behavioral file had described an infant, listless, reactive to stimuli, but not initiating, the expected torpor of a young post-gestation organism settling into its new environment. What I saw through that port was not torpor. Joey 7 was still. There's a kind of stillness that's the absence of energy. And there's a kind of stillness, the concentration of it. A spent coil is still. A loaded spring is also still. These are not the same thing. The specimen was on its back. And its face. What passed for its face, the arrangement of features that occupied the upper portion of its body, was pointed directly at the observation port, directly at me. In the low light of the bay, the irises were wide and fixed, and the quality of the attention in them was wrong, in a way I felt before I could name. I had worked with a dozen xenobiological classifications in 6 years. I had spent weeks on Calderon's moon doing observational work with apex-tier predator specimens. I had logged more contact hours with non-human intelligences than most of the instructors on levels 1 through 3 combined. I knew the difference between an animal looking at you and an intelligence assessing you. Joey 7 was assessing me. I wrote that in my personal log that night. I did not write it in the official assessment form, because I had logged 4 hours of observation and 1 subjective impression, and subjective impressions without corroborating data are the kind of entry that gets your credibility questioned by administrators who have never left level 1. Chen. I had 14 existing friction points with Director Meyerling's office. I did not need a 15th before I had gathered anything worth defending. So I wrote it in my personal log, and I kept it there, and I went back the next morning. The second day, I met the neighbors. The residential block on level 4 had a small common area, 4 chairs, a narrow table, a beverage station. People who used it were the permanent staff and the posting rotations. And they had the particular social organization of people who spend too much time in close quarters. A hierarchy of tenure, a shared shorthand, a collective agreement not to ask certain questions too directly. There was a couple in the adjacent residential unit. Artis's assistants, a man named Edson and his partner Marge, who had been on 4 for 3 years. Marge brought food to the common area in the evenings. She was warm, and a little too careful. The way people are warm when they are afraid, and have decided that warmth is the appropriate cover for it. Edson was quieter. He watched me the way Artis watched me, with that same quality of having something to say that he'd decided not to say. There was a young woman named Sally, a student intern on her final posting rotation, who had been assigned to level 4 for the preceding 4 weeks. She was cheerful in the uncomplicated way of someone who doesn't yet know what the place is. She had not yet acquired the caution. I liked Sally. I tried not to, because liking people in a temporary assignment is the kind of thing that complicates your objectivity. But she was hard not to like. She brought me coffee the second morning without being asked. She wanted to talk about the specimens on 4. She'd been running errands through the corridors, the Kirkor delivering OZA files, picking up samples, and she had developed opinions. She thought most of the specimens were fascinating. She had not yet been assigned to observe Joey 7 directly. I didn't warn her. I didn't have enough to justify a warning yet. I write that down, and it doesn't get any easier to read. By the end of the first week, I had logged 41 hours of observation through the port and 6 hours of in-bay assessment. The kind where you enter the bay with a documented purpose, you complete your measurements and behavioral checks, and you exit. Standard protocol. The in-bay sessions had a fixed format: enter, conduct assessment, exit log. There was no protocol for what to do if the specimen's behavioral responses during assessment didn't match the registered classification. Joey 7 did during in-bay assessment was watch me. Not the reactive watching of an infant registering a presence. Tracking, deliberate, patient watching of something that was taking inventory. It watched my hands. It watched my face. It watched the location of the bay door and the keypad I used to enter the access code. On the third in-bay session, it made a sound. Not the distress vocalization recorded in the behavioral file, Not any sound that matched the developmental stage notation, a low, organized sound with a rhythm that was not random. I had heard apex-tier predators make sounds designed to stun prey into momentary stillness. The mechanism there is understood. A frequency range calibrated to the prey species' auditory neurological interface, enough to produce a quarter second of involuntary arrest that serves the predator's approach. Joey 7 produced was not that. It was slower. It had structure. If I had to describe it in terms a musician might recognize, it had something like meter, a beat, and then a pause, and then a variation on the beat, and then a return. Chaotic, not primitive, composed. I stood in the center of the bay during the third in-bay session, and I listened to it for approximately 12 seconds. Before I wrote my notes, completed my measurements, and exited through the primary door. I stood outside the bay for another 10 seconds after the door closed, with my pen on my notepad, and I wrote, "Specimen vocalizing with organized rhythmic structure, source and mechanism unclear, functional purpose unknown." Then I wrote, "Do not let this one go without an explanation." That last line was for me, myself. 6 months later, if I had softened and needed a reminder of what I'd actually thought. The fourth and fifth in-bay sessions confirmed the keypad observation. Joey 7 did not look at the keypad when I entered my access code. It watched my hands. Just my hands. The specific angle of my fingers on the pad. The sequence of movements. I tested this on the fifth session by entering the code more slowly than usual. The specimen's gaze tracked each movement with the same precise attention, regardless of the pace. It was not recognizing the keypad as a category of object. It was memorizing a specific input sequence through the visual record of my hands performing it. 6 months old. I wrote in my official assessment form that the specimen was exhibiting cognitive development consistent with the upper range of its classification. That was true. It was also the most dramatic understatement I have ever committed to an official document. I want to describe the official assessment form briefly because it matters. The form had 7 sections. The first 3 covered physical measurements: length, mass, integument condition, nutritional intake recorded in milliliters. The fourth covered motor development, with a checklist of developmental milestones appropriate for the specimen's age class. Fifth covered sensory responses: light, sound, temperature, tactile. The sixth covered social response. Did the specimen register the presence of the assessor? Did it respond to vocalization? Did it demonstrate approach or avoidance behavior? The seventh was a free text section, labeled Additional Observations, capped at 250 words by the form's formatting. Every meaningful thing I observed about Joey 7 went into the 250-word free text section. The rest of the form I completed accurately. The measurements were what they were. But the form's architecture was designed for a specimen that occupied the threat classification it had been assigned, and Joey 7 did not occupy that classification. The form had no section for specimen demonstrating retention of complex sequential motor data. The form had no section for organized rhythmic vocalization of unknown origin and mechanism. The form had no section for assessor notes significant gap between registered classification and observed behavior. The form had a 250-word free text box. I filled it every session. I overflowed it and wrote the overflow in my personal log. The headaches started on day 9. I want to be clear about what I mean by headaches, because the clinical term undersells it. What I mean is, I began waking up with a specific kind of pressure behind my eyes that was not there when I went to sleep, and a specific quality of fatigue that was not proportional to the hours I had actually rested, and a specific sense, subtle, nagging, like a word you can't quite place, that certain things I had written in my personal log were perhaps overstated. Perhaps the concern was excessive. Perhaps the specimen was exactly what the original threat assessment said it was. Perhaps 6 years of field work had given me a tendency to overread situations, to see threat calibration where there was only routine xenobiological development. I recognized this thought pattern on day 11, which is probably the most important thing I did in the entire 2-week posting, and possibly the most important thing I have ever done. I recognized it because it felt like a thought, but it didn't feel like my thought. It had a slightly different texture than the thoughts I generate myself, a smoothness to it, an absence of the rough edges that my actual worries tend to have. My worries about the specimen had rough edges. They caught on things. They woke me up at odd hours with specific images from specific in-bay sessions. The reassuring thoughts were smooth and rounded and settled perfectly, like something that had been shaped to fit a space rather than having grown there naturally. Had read in the supplementary xenobiology literature about a class of high-cognition organisms that demonstrated what the researchers called lateral neurological influence, the ability to project a form of low-level cognitive interference across short distances, sufficient to affect emotional regulation and, in prolonged exposure, the formation of new assessments and judgments. The research was preliminary. The classification was disputed. The organisms in question had been studied in controlled conditions, isolated, brief exposures, carefully logged and documented. Orens was not in a controlled study. I had been living 40 meters from its nursery bay for 11 days. I wrote this down in my personal log in plain language. I wrote, "I believe the specimen is generating lateral neurological influence and that I have been partially affected. I am choosing to act on my pre-exposure assessments rather than my current emotional state, because my current emotional state is not mine." Wrote that. Then I went to Artis. Artis listened to everything I said. He sat very still across the table in his office, and he listened. And when I was done, he folded his hands and told me that the lateral influence hypothesis was one theory among several regarding Joey 7's exceptional neural output, and that the protocol for managing potential exposure was to reduce contact hours, increase rest periods, and continue documenting. He told me the threat classification was under review. He told me the Administrative Council was aware of the specimen's development profile and was monitoring the situation closely. He told me all of this with the careful, practiced quality of a man, reciting a position he had arrived at through a process that was no longer fully his own. I walked out of his office. I did not go back to mine. I went to the common area, and I sat down, and I thought about what I actually knew versus what I could prove. I knew 3 previous observers had stopped filing entries, one mid-sentence. What I knew, the specimen had neural activity that its classification did not account for. What I knew, I had been experiencing a specific kind of cognitive smoothing that had the signature, in the literature, of external interference. What I knew, Artis had just described a monitoring protocol with the flat recitation of a man reading from a script written by something else. What I could prove, nothing that the Administrative Council hadn't already decided to classify as within acceptable parameters. I went back to my residential unit. I pulled out my personal log. I reread every entry from day one. I was looking for the point at which my own entries started to smooth out. The point where my rough-edged specific concerns began to soften into general reassurances. I found it on day 7. On day 6, I had written a very specific note about the way the specimen tracked the keypad during an in-bay session. On day 8, I had written that I was perhaps reading too much into the keypad observation, given the specimen's developmental stage. Day 7 was the gap. I had no entry for day 7. I did not remember not writing an entry on day 7. I remembered day 7. I had been in the bay in the morning. And then I had been in the common area in the evening. And I had spoken to Marge about the food she'd brought. And I had gone to sleep. Full day clearly remembered, and no log entry to match it. I don't lose days. I have logged every operational day for 6 years. I have log entries for days I was sick with a respiratory virus that took my voice for a week. I had not logged day 7. That told me something. Told me the exposure had been more acute than I'd assessed. And it told me the acute phase had coincided with a specific window. And it told me that whatever Joey 7 had been doing during that window had been sufficient to interrupt a habit so deep, it was essentially automatic. I wrote all of this down. Then I did something that I want to document clearly for anyone reading this report. I decided to continue. Not because I had orders to. Not because the Administrative Council had directed me to stay. Because 3 people had started this observation and not finished it. And the specimen was still in that bay. And if I walked out there was a non-trivial probability that the 4th, 5th, and 6th observers would have the same result, until the file held enough half-finished entries that the pattern itself became undeniable. Except by then, the question of what Joey 7 was capable of would no longer be theoretical. Decided to continue. I adjusted my methodology. I reduced in-bay time to the minimum required by protocol. I began logging in every hour on the hour rather than in summary form at the end of each day. I changed the access code for my residential unit without filing the change through the standard administrative channel. I was precise about everything I did, and I moved through it the way I had learned to move through difficult field assignments. Not quickly, not emotionally, but without stopping. On day 12, Sally disappeared. She was there at the evening meal. She was not there at 0600. Residential unit showed no signs of a hurried exit. Her personal items were in place. Her bunk had been slept in, and then made. Her work bag was on the chair where she left it. She was simply not present in any space I could access on level 4. I reported the absence to Artis. Artis told me that Sally had been transferred to a different rotation, effective that morning, and that the transfer had been logged through administrative channels. I asked to see the transfer log. Artis told me the administrative documentation was being processed and would be available through standard channels within 72 hours. His voice was even, his hands were folded. The smoothed-out quality of his affect was, by now, something I could read like a register. A particular flatness that replaced the normal micro-variation of a person telling the truth versus a person reciting something that had been arranged for them. I went back to my unit and I called the administrative office on level 1. I asked about Sally's transfer. The administrator on duty had no record of a transfer filed in the preceding 48 hours. I asked her to check again. She checked again. She told me the last administrative action logged for the level 4 staff roster had been my own arrival posting, 14 days prior. Thanked her and ended the call. Then I sat on the edge of my bunk for a while. Not a long while. Long enough to feel the weight of it settle, and then to set the weight aside. Because there was work to do, and weight doesn't help you do it. I had been in the field long enough to know the difference between fear that stops you and fear that sharpens you. First kind is useless. The second kind is the only appropriate response to a situation that actually warrants it. This situation warranted it. I documented the discrepancy between Artis's account of Sally's transfer and the administrative log. I documented the absence of any transfer record. I documented Sally's personal items, still in her unit, the work bag on the chair, the personal datapad charging beside her bunk, the half-finished annotation she'd been writing in her observation notebook. I was thorough and specific. Then, I went back to the common area, and I sat in one of the 4 chairs, and I thought through the timeline. Joey 7 had been on level 4 for 11 months before I arrived. In those 11 months, there had been a succession of assessment personnel, observers, researchers, support staff. Personnel log, which I had not yet pulled but intended to, would tell me exactly how many. I could estimate from the behavioral files 3 previous observers that the attrition rate was high. High enough that Artis, who had been here for at least 3 years by the residential block's social hierarchy, had simply absorbed it into the rhythm of level 4 the way a person who lives near a rail line stops hearing the trains. But the rate of attrition had accelerated. I was certain of this because the behavioral files 3 observers had logged entries over a total of 21 days, combined before their entries stopped. The early period of Joey 7's development, the first few months of the 11, must have had observers who lasted longer, generated more entries, before the specimen had fully developed whatever it was doing. Pattern in the file was clear if you read it backward. Shorter and shorter observation periods, each observer lasting less time than the one before. Joey 7 had been learning, refining, getting better at the process of elimination, 6 months old. I went to the beverage station and poured coffee I didn't particularly want, and drank it standing up, looking at the corridor that led to the primary access route of the nursery bay. The corridor was quiet. The level 4 ambient hum was steady. Everything looked like it looked every morning, and that was the precise problem. Because I had now spent 8 days learning what level 4 actually was underneath what it looked like, and the gap between those two things was not a minor discrepancy. I needed to move. I needed to do something that would change the situation, rather than extend the current one. because extending the current one meant staying in a space where a highly intelligent organism with demonstrated lateral influence capability and demonstrated physical capability was loose, while the only administrator on this level was running a script that wasn't his own, and the support staff had been reduced to 2 people plus me, and one of those 2 people was missing. That was the inventory. That was the situation. I had spent 13 days being careful and thorough and methodical, and all of that had been correct and necessary, and the time for careful and methodical was not over. But it was time to be careful and methodical in a different direction. Recon 13, I found Marge. I want to say I was prepared for it, but that would be inaccurate. You can know, intellectually, that a situation has reached a particular level of severity, and still be unprepared for the specific reality of it when you turn a corner. The access corridor to the residential block had a 90-degree turn just past the beverage station. Came around that turn at 07:30 on day 13 and found Marge on the floor. Won't describe the specifics beyond what is necessary for the record. She had been dead for some hours. The cause was consistent with a violent encounter. She was positioned in a way that did not match accidental injury. Checked Edson's unit. Edson was not there. His personal items were in place. His bunk had not been slept in. The question of where Edson was had at least 2 possible answers, and neither of them was good. I did not go to Artis. I had passed the point where going to Artis was a productive option. I went back to my unit. I pulled the locker under my bunk that held my field kit. I'd carried a field kit every assignment for 6 years, and the habit had seemed excessive to the permanent level 4 staff when I arrived, and I was very glad of it now. Took out the items I needed. I checked the charge on the hand unit. I checked the charge twice. Then I put on the jacket with the interior pockets, and I went to find Joey 7. I need to explain something about the layout of level 4, because it matters for what happened next. The nursery bay, where Joey 7 was held, was accessible through 2 routes. Primary route went through the main observation corridor. Wide, well-lit, the route I had taken every day of the posting. The secondary route went through the service corridor that ran parallel to the observation wing, accessible through a maintenance access panel in the wall of the Level 4 residential common area. The existence of the secondary route was in the facility schematics, which I had read on my first night because I always read facility schematics on my first night. I went through the service corridor. The maintenance access panel opened onto a narrow passage with exposed conduit running along the ceiling and a floor that was slightly uneven, the kind of passage that gets less attention from the cleaning systems, that accumulates a thin layer of grime that records footprints. I crouched in the entrance of the passage with my light on low, and I looked at the footprints. There were old ones. Maintenance staff, probably, from weeks past, the grime disturbed and resettled. There were recent ones, small ones, very small, running along the left wall, stopping approximately 15 meters in at a junction where the service passage branched. Specimen at the developmental stage Joey 7's was supposed to be at was not ambulatory. The behavioral file noted this explicitly. Post-gestation specimens of this classification were not, independently, mobile for the first 8 to 12 months of development. They did not make footprints in service corridors. The size of those prints was consistent with a 6-month-old organism. They were also precise. Toe ball heel distribution, even spacing, the deliberate stride of something that knew exactly where it was going. I followed them to the junction. At the junction they split, one set continuing deeper into the service passage toward the external maintenance access, and one set turning right, back toward the nursery bay. The set that turned right was more recent, the grime, less fully settled around those impressions. The edges still slightly sharp. Joey 7 had been out. Joey 7 had gone back. I thought about Sally. I thought about Marge. I thought about the 3 observers whose files ended without sign-off. I thought about Artis's hands folded precisely on his desk, and the smoothed-out quality of his voice, and the administrative transfer record that didn't exist. Then I went through the service passage, and I came out behind the nursery bay. The bay had a secondary access panel, a maintenance hatch, roughly 60 centimeters square, set into the back wall at floor level. It was latched from the outside. I crouched beside it and I listened. From inside the bay, I could hear nothing. Not the ambient hum of the climate systems. Not the sound of an organism at rest. Nothing. In a room that should have been occupied. I opened the hatch. I put my light through first, then I looked. The bay was empty. The padding on the floor was disturbed in a specific pattern. Concentrated pressure marks, near the center where the specimen typically rested, and then a trail of disturbed padding leading toward the primary bay door. Primary door was closed. The keypad beside it showed an access log indicator in the active state. The log was running. Crossed the bay and pulled the access log from the pad. The last entry was a code input at 034 that morning. Code was mine, my code. Input at 0340 when I was in my residential unit, 3 hours before I found Marge. I had not been in the nursery bay at 0340. My code had been used, but not by me. The only way my code was available to something in that bay was if the specimen had observed me entering it and had retained it across 12 days of in-bay sessions and had then used it to let itself out. 6 months old by developmental classification, barely post-emergence, non-ambulatory, my code, its use. SEAM-SU 340. I stood in the empty bay and I let that land fully. Because partial understanding is more dangerous than full understanding. And I needed to understand what I was dealing with completely. I was dealing with an organism that had been cognitively benchmarked far above its registered classification. So far above it that the gap between the official file and the observed reality was not a measurement error. It was a deliberate misrepresentation. Someone had known what Joey 7 was and had written a threat assessment that said otherwise. And I did not need to speculate too hard about who had written it or why. Because I had watched the director's office generate 14 separate friction points with me in 6 years for the crime of documenting accurately, and accurate documentation was clearly not what the Meyerling Institute was primarily in the business of. The specimen was loose on level 4. It had my access code. It had demonstrated, through whatever mechanism it used for lateral neurological influence, the ability to affect the cognition of the people around it, subtly at first, then more directly as it needed. It had been methodical about it. It had worked through the observations staff in sequence. It had, apparently, worked through Marge and Edson and Sally in whatever order served its needs. And it knew I was the outlier, because I was still filing accurate logs, because I had recognized the smoothing, because I was the one who had come in through the service corridor rather than the primary access. And I was the one now standing in its empty bay with my hand unit charged and my jacket on. And it had been watching me for long enough to know what that meant. The lights in the bay went out. Not a power failure. The climate systems kept running. The keypad remained lit. Just the bay lights. Cut deliberately from somewhere that had access to the local circuit controls. In the dark, the maintenance hatch behind me was a rectangle of slightly less dark where my light had gone through. I moved to the wall beside the primary door. I kept my back to the wall. I did not use my light. I waited. You learn patience in field work. You learn it the same way you learn everything else in field work. Not from instruction, but from the specific, concrete consequence of running out of it prematurely. I had run out of patience once, early in my career, in a field situation that cost me 3 weeks in the medical wing and cost a colleague of mine considerably more than that. I had not run out of patience since. I stood against the wall of that bay in the dark, and I breathed slowly, and I let my eyes work with what light there was, and I waited. It was 11 minutes, by my count. The maintenance hatch opened. I saw it move, the small rectangle of slightly less dark shifting as the hatch swung inward on its hinges. Shh. There was a pause, the length of a careful assessment, and then movement through the hatch, low to the floor, deliberate. I turned my light on. Joey 7 was in the center of the bay, between me and the maintenance hatch. In the direct light it was, I will use the accurate word, wrong. Not in the way that most xenobiological specimens are wrong to a human observer. The productive wrongness of genuine biological otherness. Wrong in the way that something designed to approximate a form it doesn't fully understand is wrong. Close enough to register. Off enough to create a specific discomfort that doesn't resolve into anything you can name quickly. Face, if you called it that, was tracking me. The eyes were wide and still, and the attention in them was exactly what I'd seen through the observation port on day 1. Full assessment, patient inventory. It made the sound. The low, organized, rhythmic sound from the third in bay session. This close, without the bay door between us, I could feel it more than hear it. A physical register, low in the chest, the frequency of something designed to affect a nervous system, rather than to communicate information. The lateral influence, I thought, working through the air rather than across 40 meters of corridor, getting harder now, at close range, because it needed to. My head went smooth and warm for approximately 4 seconds. The rough edges softened. The concern became manageable. The weight of everything I had seen in the last 72 hours began to lift into a comfortable abstraction where it could be regarded from a distance rather than felt directly. I had been here before. On day 7, I had been here and I hadn't recognized it fast enough. Now I recognized it in the first 4 seconds, and I said out loud, to myself, to the specimen, to no one in particular, no, not an argument, not a refusal, exactly, just a word. Said the way you say a word to a fact that's trying to become something other than a fact. No, this is what I know. These are the things I saw. Sally is gone. Marge is on the floor in the access corridor. 3 observers stopped filing. 1 mid-sentence. These are not abstractions. These are specific things, and I know what they are. And the warmth and the smoothness in my head is not mine, and I am not going to let it stay. The smooth warmth ran hard against the specific, concrete, rough-edged things I had been logging for 13 days, and the specific things held. They held because I had written them down. Every hour, and writing things down, is the human equivalent of load-bearing infrastructure. The writing doesn't change the facts. It just makes the facts harder to move. Joey 7 made the sound again, harder. I felt it in my back teeth. I did not waver. I think that surprised it. I think. And I will note in this report that this is my interpretation, not a measured observation, though I will also note that I have spent 6 years interpreting the behavioral responses of non-human intelligences, and I am not inclined to dismiss my own reading. I think the specimen had encountered a significant number of humans at that point, and every one of them had was within a predictable range. And I was outside that range, and that gap between expectation and result required it to recalculate. It moved, not toward me, toward the maintenance hatch. Fast. Faster than any post-gestation organism at 6 months development should have been capable of moving. The locomotion wrong in the same way the rest of it was wrong. Too fluid, too precise. Without the developmental wobble that belongs to a young organism still calibrating its motor functions. This was not a young organism still calibrating anything. This was something that had been calibrated at creation and had been practicing for 6 months in a nursery bay while a succession of observers filed smoothed-out reports and then stopped filing at all. Between it and the maintenance hatch, the 3 seconds of the crossing were, I will be honest, not graceful. It was fast and it was low, and it hit me at approximately knee height with more force than its apparent mass should have generated. Another thing the file had not mentioned, the specific strength output, the specific density. I went down, it went over me. I caught it with my right hand as it passed, got a grip, and then the grip went wrong, because it was slick, in a way the file had also not mentioned, and it pulled free, and the momentum of pulling free put me into the bay door with my left shoulder, taking most of the impact. Bullet in the shoulder I mentioned at the beginning of this report. That was later. I'm getting to that. What I did in the next moment was not a procedure from any field manual I had ever read. I pushed off the bay door, found the footing on the disturbed padding, and I went after it through the maintenance hatch. Not because I had a clear plan, because it was in a service corridor with my access code, and a demonstrated capacity to affect the cognition of every human it had spent time near. And if it got to the level 1 access shaft with those 2 items, it was no longer a level 4 problem. The service corridor was dark. My light was on the floor of the bay where I'd dropped it when I went into the door. I moved in the dark, one hand on the left wall, listening. The door was narrow enough that I could feel the air disturbance of something moving ahead of me. Not much, but enough. I followed the disturbance, and the disturbance turned at the junction I'd noted on my way in, taking the branch toward the external maintenance access. The external maintenance access on level 4 opened onto a utility shaft that ran vertically through the facility's infrastructure. A shaft the staff used for equipment transport, with manual ladder rungs set into the wall and a mechanical lift for heavy loads. The shaft connected Level 4 to Level 2, bypassing Level 3. Level 2 was the administrative wing. Level 2 was where Director Meyerling's office was, and the Administrative Council's chamber, and the staff residential block for the senior faculty. People who had not been on Level 4 and had not been exposed to whatever Joey 7 had been doing down here. Not yet. The maintenance access hatch was open when I reached it. The shaft beyond it was faintly lit by the safety strips on the rungs. I looked up. On the ladder, approximately 3 meters above me, Joey 7 was climbing. It was fast. It was already past the second safety strip. I did not call out. Calling out was not an option that served any purpose I could identify. I went up the ladder. There is a particular quality of physical effort when you are operating past the point where the effort should have stopped, past the shoulder impact, past the ankle, that had taken a bad angle when I'd gone down on the bay padding, past the point in the timeline where a reasonable assessment of physical conditions would have suggested a pause to stabilize. Quality of that effort is not heroic. I want to be clear about that. It is simply the mechanical application of continued movement to a situation where stopping has worse consequences than continuing. I went up the ladder because the alternative was to not go up the ladder, and I had calculated what not going up the ladder meant. I reached the Level 2 hatch 8 seconds after Joey 7 went through it. Level 2 at night was quieter than Level 4 in the day. The lights were on the nighttime cycle. Reduced ambient, the kind of light that does the minimum necessary for safety without keeping anyone awake. I came through the hatch into the equipment, staging alcove off the main administrative corridor, and I listened. The corridor was empty in both directions. To the left was the administrative suite. To the right was the director's residential wing. I heard the sound from the right, the organized, low, rhythmic sound, moving away from me at the pace of something that knew where it was going. I went right. The director's residential wing had 6 units. 5 of them were dark under the doors. The 6th, at the end of the corridor, had light underneath it. The specific warm light of a room occupied by someone awake and alert. Not the cooler blue of a display screen in a sleeping room. The light had a shadow moving in it. The kind of shadow that means someone's standing and moving rather than sitting. The door was not locked. I turned the handle and pushed. Director Meyerling was standing at his desk, which was the furthest point in the room from the door. He was in his nightclothes, and his hair was disordered, and his hands were at his sides in the very still way of someone who had been standing precisely where they were standing for some time and had no intention of moving. His face was in the particular flat state I had learned to recognize. His eyes were on the center of the room, and in the center of the room, on the surface of his desk, was Joey 7. The specimen was facing the director. The sound was coming from it at a level that made the air between them feel thick and pressured in a way I could feel from the doorway. The director's face was not responding to the sound in any way that was normal. His expression was the expression of someone in the process of being reorganized. Did not have time for a measured assessment of options. I crossed the room. The specimen heard me, or processed me, or registered my approach through whatever sensory mechanism it actually used, because it turned before I had crossed half the distance. It turned, and it made the sound directly at me, full intensity, and this time the warmth was not a gentle smoothing. This time it was a shove. A physical sensation behind the eyes, and at the base of the skull, the kind of pressure that belongs to a concussion rather than a suggestion. I kept moving. I caught Joey 7 at the desk. The grip was bad again. The slick surface, the wrong density, the locomotion that adapted faster than I could anticipate. And we went off the desk onto the floor of the director's residential unit, and the director did not move to help me because the director had been reorganized past the point of independent action. The floor was hard composite. My ribs introduced themselves to it in a specific, immediate, and unambiguous way. I kept my grip, the specimen fought. I want to document that accurately because the file that exists on Joey 7 describes a non-threat, and the experience of being on the floor of the director's residential unit in a physical contest with it was not consistent with non-threat. The strength output, as I had noted when it knocked me into the bay door, did not match the apparent mass or the developmental classification. The adaptability of its movement was beyond anything the behavioral file had described. If I had approached this encounter with the expectations the file had set, I would have been insufficient. I approached it with the expectations I had built over 13 days of accurate documentation. And that was a different preparation entirely. The hand unit was in my right jacket pocket. Getting to it with my right hand while managing the grip with my left was the worst 40 seconds of the encounter. And I will not detail every step of it because this is an incident report and not a memoir. What matters is that I got to it. Matter is that what happened next was fast and deliberate, and I had decided to do it before I came through the maintenance hatch on level 4, and I did not waver. The sound stopped. Director sat down on the floor, very slowly, like a puppet whose strings had been let out gradually. He put his hands in his lap, and he blinked several times, and he looked around the room in the manner of someone reassembling a context that had become unfamiliar. He looked at me. He looked at the floor in front of me, he said, in a voice that was thin and uncertain, and nothing like the carefully modulated voice I had heard in the administrative communications from his office. What happened? Not a question. The vocal inflection was flat. A statement of not knowing rather than a request for information. I sat on the floor of his residential unit for a moment. My shoulder was doing something that had moved past pain into the numb register that means the pain is still there, but the body has tabled it for later. My ribs were filing a formal complaint. My ankle was somewhere in the middle ground between functional and not, which is a precarious place to be when you still need to walk. 11, I said. I was answering the question I'd been building toward for 13 days. The question the 4-page behavioral section hadn't answered, and the half-finished observer entries hadn't answered, and Artis's folded hands hadn't answered. At minimum, I need the full personnel log for level 4, going back to the first posting observer. The director looked at me for a long moment. The reassembly behind his eyes was still in progress, the flat quality slowly becoming something more dimensional. He said, "You're the 4th assessor." "I know. The previous 3. I know," I said. "I need the personnel log." He got it. It took him 12 minutes, because his system access required verification, and his hands were unsteady, but he got it. The personnel log for level 4 going back to the original posting, dated 11 months prior, showed the names I'd expected, and several I hadn't. 11 names across 11 months before mine. 11 names that all had one thing in common. They appeared in the log, and then they stopped appearing, and the entries that should have documented their departure or transfer did not exist. 11, and then me. I filed the full incident report from the director's unit that night. Everything I've documented here, plus the physical evidence inventory from the bay, plus the access log showing my code used at IRO 340, plus the personnel log discrepancy, filed it through the Institute's primary administrative channel, and simultaneously through the oversight channel that bypasses Institute administration entirely, because I had spent 6 years watching Institute administration manage its friction points, and I was not going to let this become friction point 15. The medics arrived at level 4 before dawn. They found Marge. They found what remained of the service corridor and the maintenance areas between level 2 and 4. They found Artis in his office, which I had not yet reached, sitting in his chair with the same flat quality of reorganized affect that I had seen in the director, though further along and more complete. Whether Artis came back from it fully is in the medical records, and not my business to report here. They found essence in the secondary maintenance shaft between 4 and 3. I'll leave that entry at its minimum. He was found, and the cause was consistent with what I had concluded about Marge. They did not find Sally. The search is ongoing. I have included in my supplementary filing everything I know about the timeline of her disappearance, which is not enough to give a complete answer. And the absence of that complete answer is the part I carry with me, the part that sits with the rough edges and doesn't smooth out. I left the Institute the following morning. Not by discharge. I have not been discharged, and the investigation remains open. I left, because I had completed the work I had stayed to complete, and because standing in a place beyond the point of usefulness is its own kind of error. And I had made enough errors in this assignment without adding that one. The Administrative Councils is reviewing the Meyerling Institute's research protocols, the threat classification system, the oversight gaps that allowed 11 postings to end without triggering a formal review. These reviews have timelines and processes and official channels, and I am cooperating with all of them, and I believe some of them will result in changes that matter, and some of them will result in documents that sit in files and don't get opened. I have submitted my 6-year log archive to the oversight body as a complete record, every entry, including the personal logs, including the ones I didn't file through official channels, because I knew what official channels did with accurate documentation. It is all there, it is specific, it has rough edges, it does not smooth out. What I know about what happened on level 4, when I think about it in the particular hard light of the early morning before the day gets underway, is this. The Institute built something it could not classify accurately, and then classified it as harmless, because the alternative was a harder conversation, and then built a system of oversight around it that was calibrated to maintain that classification, rather than to test it. That system worked very well for as long as the thing it was designed to protect stayed in the nursery bay and stayed quiet. Joey 7 had not been quiet for a long time. The file just didn't say so. There are at least 3 other Institute facilities running genetics research programs under Director Meyerling's original methodology. She have documented this in the supplementary filing. Each of those facilities has its own level 4 equivalent, its own observation personnel on short rotations, its own carefully managed assessment forms with 250-word free text sections, its own administrative channels that run through the same Institute administrative body that managed Level 4's discrepancies for 11 months without triggering review. I have made formal requests for the personnel logs of all 3 facilities. As of the date of this report, 2 of those requests are pending review, and 1 has been acknowledged without response. I have escalated through the oversight channel. I will continue to escalate. I do not know what the logs will show. I know what I suspect, and I know that suspicion without documentation is just anxiety. And I am not in the business of anxiety. I am in the business of documentation. So I will get the logs, and I will read them, and I will file what I find in specific and accurate language with rough edges intact. And I will not stop until the file is complete. That is the only thing I know how to do. After 13 days on level 4, I am reasonably confident it is also the thing that kept me alive. I know what I did on level 4, and I know what it cost. And I know that there are 11 names in a personnel log that don't have the endings they should have. And one of them is a young woman who brought me coffee on the 2nd morning, without being asked, and wanted to talk about the specimens because she found them fascinating. And she hadn't yet learned the caution, and I didn't warn her when warning her might have meant something. I keep that. I don't smooth it out. The ending I told you at the beginning was that I walked out. That's true. I also want to tell you what I walked out with, because I think it matters for anyone who reads this report and has to make a decision about what comes next, about the other research programs, the other classifications, the other nursery bays in other institute facilities that might have their own 4-page behavioral sections and their own first-day observers who haven't yet recognized the texture of a thought that isn't theirs. What I walked out with is this: 12 years of training and 6 years of field work, and the specific, stubborn, entirely human conviction that accurate documentation is not excessive, that rough edges are load-bearing, and that the moment you let someone smooth out your assessment of what you actually saw is the moment the assessment stops belonging to you. I walked out with that. I intend to keep it. The next observer who gets assigned to a level 4 equivalent will find my full archive in the oversight database, cross-referenced, indexed, and annotated, every hour of every day. Everything I saw before I understood what I was seeing, and everything I saw after. It's all there, specific, with the rough edges intact, because that's the part that holds.